Hello, everyone. We're going to be looking at the society, religion, and reform in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. This chapter is chapter 11 in Seco and also chapter 12 in Brinkley. So let's get started right away. One of the big first things of this time period was the Hudson River School. The Hudson River School was a art school that was founded on the basis of this large, sweeping natural environment that Americans had. We had a huge amount of land and other things going on for us. That this was a huge art movement that was really focused on nature, with Thomas Cole and Frederick Church being the two largest artists in this time period. This will play into our Romantic time period, and this whole ideology of America had this bountiful amount of land that we had available to us, always pushing westward. And you see Frederick Church and Thomas Cole, the two biggest of the artists. There's also Albert Berkstead and Astor Durand. And a big part of this individualism was coined by Alexis de Tocqueville, who was this French dignitary, egalitarian, philosopher, writer who came over to America and really saw America being vastly different than Europe. We had access to vote, we had public education, we had land, and we had this egalitarian spirit, basically where equality and democracy were really big key parts of American idealism, which made us so much different than the European counterparts. One big philosophy during this time period was called Transcendentalism. It was really rooted in New England and the ever-changing economy and society New England was to offer. New England had started their textile industry right after the War of 1812, and it continued to change as a society through the 1830s and 40s and 50s, especially with the advent of the Lowell system and the massive immigrants coming over from Ireland. And many New Englanders were sort of disillusioned by this, you could say. They wanted to transcend or go beyond the senses that had changed into a more urban lifestyle and to get back to the core roots of yourself and nature and spirit. One of the leading philosophers, ideologists of this time period was Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was an essayist and a writer and really believed that this whole economy-based system that America was moving toward was not healthy for the mind, and you had to sort of transcend or go beyond that and be spiritual and philosophical even within this new setting. His famous quote was, "What lies behind us and what lies before us are small matters compared to what lies within us." And some of his influence, most famous one, was a guy named Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Walden, which was all about the spirit of nature and oneself and basically isolationism, where basically to be whole you had to be isolated from the population and the new economy and world that was taking us. He also believed in civil disobedience, where basically he believed that it was right to break laws if those laws were unjust. He thought that basically paying taxes during the 1840s was unjust because those tax dollars were going directly to fund things like the Mexican-American War and major sort of manifest destiny / pushes to gain more land. And the big key here, which you should write down, is the whole aspect of gaining more land, especially more land below the 3630 line to expand into slavery. And here's a famous quote from Walden. "I went to the woods because I had wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and to see if I could not learn what I had to teach, and not, when it came to die, discover that I had not lived." Also, Margaret Fuller was a woman who also took part in Transcendentalism. There was sexism during this time period, so the Transcendentalists thought women were not as able to be philosophical and write an essay like some of the men counterparts. Some of the authors of this time period, not connected directly to the Transcendentalism movement, but also part of this whole American spirit. For example, one of the early ones was James Fenimore Cooper. He wrote basically The Leatherneck Tales and Last of the Mohicans, which were known for adventure, suspense, and this connection with nature. You had Walt Whitman, who wrote Leaves of Grass, about uniqueness and character and the individual. He basically was in the closet and very, recluse when it comes to his sexuality, which he was homosexual. And maybe that was some of the ideology behind this Leaves of Grass and uniqueness. You also had Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville writing about, just the past with the Puritan Scarlet Letter and sort of breaking apart from that, and Moby Dick. And the darker themes of demands and reality and individualism. So Moby Dick was about this individual, Captain Ahab, chasing this sort of this white whale on this mythical path. And it was really about just this inner struggle within himself and trying to come up with these ideas and these ideologies that he sort of was, within himself. You also had one Southern writer, Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote during this time period. In his work of The House of Seven Gables and The Raven, compared a lot of pain and horror and just a lot of problems with himself and society. Some of these transcendentalists thought that there was no way to fully live a utopian society in the urban world, so they had to sort of branch out. So they actually bought a farm in western Massachusetts to become self-sufficient utopian living. They actually succeeded somewhat for a short amount of time. Eventually, though, this experiment did fail with just not enough buy-in to really make this work. There's also a lot of other communalism going on, so it wasn't just that. There was also a lot of religion communalism at the same time. So this shows you that a lot of people were disillusioned with society. A lot of people were having some problems with society as a whole. Here's some of the religious communities that were more of the famous ones. The Shakers, founded by Anne Lee Stanley in Albany. Basically, they gave up celibacy, they abstained from sex and marriage and ownership of private property. They were against war, politics, and use of alcohol. And, really, they didn't really have a strong amount of numbers because they could not repopulate themselves. Eventually, their numbers will decline. You had the Florist movements, or New Harmony, founded by Charles Fourier, by advocating this creation of these self-supporting phalanxes or communities, where basically every single member owned all aspects of the communities. They're mostly in the Midwest of like Indiana and Ohio and Iowa and places like that. And again, most of them did end in failure. You also have the Noyes Oneida communities from upstate New York. And they believe in perfectionism. Basically, they believe in this complex marriage where no one single party was married to each other, but they're all complexly married to one each other. And the relevance of this is that even though most of the communities failed, it showed that people were pushing the boundaries of what society had to offer. And basically, a lot of people were disillusioned or had problems with how this society was growing. And this just shows you the divisions and the problems that people were trying to escape from. One successful religious utopian community was the Mormons. It was founded by Joseph Smith in 1830 when an angel Morini came down and basically told him where these secret golden plates had been buried. He dug them up and he scribbled down the scripture, which then eventually became the Book of Mormon, or basically the Book of the Latter-day Saints. And they will go from place to place to place. Eventually, let's see, I think of a map of that. They'll basically go from New York to Ohio to Missouri, back to Illinois, back to Missouri, and then eventually to Utah. Basically, what was happening is that people didn't like the way that they were looking at religion. They believed that they were not true Christians. They really believed also that they were disagreed of this whole polygamy aspect, where basically one man would have multiple wives. Eventually, they were driven from America because, again, they didn't want to give up their beliefs. They were taken on this trek because Joseph Smith had died by Brigham Young. Eventually, they'll move their community to Utah, which was actually present-day Mexico, or not present-day, past-day Mexico. So this part area right here was actually in Mexico hands. But what happened, though, right after they moved out there to escape America and our policies and our anti-Mormon policies, basically what happened is America will go to war against Mexico and take over this area, and now they're back in America again. The president at the time, James Buchanan, basically told them they had to give up polygamy and other certain aspects of religion, otherwise they'd be taken over by the United States cavalry and military. So Brigham Young basically gave up some of those aspects of the Mormon faith, like polygamy, for example, to be able to be incorporated into the United States. And why this was all going on, a big sort of this whole big thing was going on, was something called the Second Great Awakening, which you really, really need to write down. I forgot to put this on this PowerPoint slide. But this whole aspect of revivalism. Charles Finney was probably the most famous preachers, and this was all connected to this Second Great Awakening. And it really focused around this new religions like Methodism and Baptist. It gave women more power within the church. It also sort of spurred this moral reform that was going to be pushed and be a big theme of this Jacksonian antebellum era. So some of the really big reform movements of this time period. Temperance, very connected to the women's and the religious movement. Crusade against drunkenness. It really was on a local level early on. Eventually, by the 1900s, it'll become more national. And actually, ending with the 18th Amendment in 1920, basically making alcohol illegal. And this is a really famous cartoon. We basically see the rise and fall of the drunkard. First is the glass with a friend. Second is a glass to keep him warm. Third is a glass too much. Fourth is drunk and riotous. Fifth is this final peak, basically. Then, sixth is to poverty. Seventh is treason by friends. 8, desperation and crime. And then 9, suicide. And of course, you see who's really at loss here is the mom and the daughter. So this basically is warning what a male drinking would basically lead to is death. You also had some medical reform. Not much, but there was starting to become more medical knowledge, some science behind doctors and medicine. One big thing was this contagion, that basically that people can pass, and spread disease from person to person. And Oliver Wendell Holmes was a doctor who sort of discovered that. A really big one was Horace Mann and his push for public education. It was actually one of Thomas Jefferson's real big ideology that every single person had to have a public education, at least a basic one. And Horace Mann's going to really push for public education to go throughout the country. It's not going to happen, but in the Northeast, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, we are going to see that. And slowly it's going to creep its way west. Really the only place that had zero public education was going to be the South. The West is going to have very low educational expectations, not because they don't want it, just because there's so few people that there's not going to be much actual educational institutions out West until a little bit later on. We'll also get the prison and mentally reform. We're going to see a major push to reform prisons and separate mentally ill patients from just criminals. Dorothea Dix is going to be a big proponent of that, where she basically says there should be special houses and hospitals for the mentally insane and mentally ill, and not just housing them in prisons. You're also going to see a large push to secure feminism. Really, the first real major feminist movement in American history is going to be in the 1840s of this antebellum time period. Really what they were wanting was voting rights and some basic equalities and educational improvements. They were not really wanting full equality with men, though. Again, ideally, sure, but not in reality. A couple of the people that led up to the Seneca Falls Convention, the Grimke sisters, they promoted civil equality in women, and they're also big parts of the abolition movement. And then you had Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who basically came forth with this convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. There, they're going to be with Lucretia Mott and several women and men, and they're going to propose this Declaration of Sentiments, which is a mock-up of the Declaration of Independence, where basically they wanted a couple of things. They wanted suffrage. They wanted voting rights. They also want property and custody laws to be given to women, especially married women. They'll draft up these sentiments. Nothing's going to really happen because of this, but it will start the ball rolling with more and more push for true feminism. A person that will come later on in the 1850s will be Susan B. Anthony, who's a little younger than the other two, and she's going to be, also a big part of this women's movement all throughout the 1800s. And last, we have abolitionism. Make sure you know that abolitionism was not a major thing going on that most Americans were participating in. It was very important. It was very a lot of noise to it. But again, most Americans were not abolitionists. Early on, a lot of Americans were like, well, maybe the best place for freed slaves would be back to Africa. So the American Colonization Society dealt with that. They tried to buy up land. They actually started their own country called Liberia, with the capital being Monrovia. And this was going to be an area that they could resettle African-American slaves back into their hinterland. It didn't work, though. Most slaves or freedmen weren't wanting to go back to Africa, and were just laden with sort of corruption and failure. You also had some major slave rebellions and revolts. David Walker promoted a rebellion. It never actually happened, though. Nat Turner led one, but it ended in failure. And really, most of these rebellions will end either before they start or in a failure, with the increasing of black codes to actually make slaves' lives even harder in the South. And then you have this evangelical abolitionism, abolitionism with almost this religious passion, you could say. The most famous of these evangelical abolitionists was William Lloyd Garrison. He came up in the 1820s. And in 1830, I think it was 1831 or 2, he created something called The Liberator, a weekly news periodical all about anti-slavery that was spread rapidly through the North. It was also so hated that it was actually banned in the South. He also was an advocate of women's rights and women's suffrage. And what he believed in is the complete, immediate, and uncompensated emancipation of slaves. He also got help from Frederick Douglass, who also wrote his own PR article called the North Star. And he also was very much an essayist and a writer and a speaker as well. You also had lots of Northerners trying to help Southern slaves escape to freedom through the Underground Railroad. The most famous was a freed slave herself, was Harriet Tubman, who helped try to bring a network of whites and blacks together to help slaves escape freedom to the North. And then you had a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was all in response to the fugitive slave law that was passed with the Compromise of 1850, which we'll talk about next chapter. But this is going to be this really widespread novel that's going to be hated by Southerners. The thought was that Northerners were slowly moving to an abolitionist standpoint, and they could not be trusted to keep slavery alive. But the problem is that a lot of Northerners still felt that abolitionism could overstep the rights of the government. The thought was, if the government can take away slaves, which is property, I mean, we know it's not property, we know they're humans, but property in the sense of it, that what's to stop the government from taking away Northern property rights? And also, what would we do with these freed slaves? How would they affect the job market, or how would they affect the wages for new labor pools? Also, there was internal divisions about where should this movement go. Should we focus on women and slaves to reform both groups of people, or just slaves themselves? A lot of sort of infighting, you could say. Okay, that is the chapter 11 MSECO. chapter 12 in Brinkley. That is the notes for today. Please review this and be familiar with this. We'll talk about this on Tuesday when we get back to class. Have a great one, guys. Good night.